this system, right? As we approach this notion of eventually attaining apotheosis, only to recognize, according to Nietzsche, that the concept is in itself devalued, the highest values become devalued, then we collapse as individuals, right? And we collapse primarily into the state of nihilism, right? As we saw much earlier in, I forget, one of the notes, Nietzsche says that the concept of nihilism is rooted in Christian morality. Specifically, it's this collapse, right? I saw myself as being comforted by the notions that were espoused within the religious ideology, only to find out that there was nothing there for me, that I did not become a god, that I was not divinized, and so on, right? Number 7, bullet point number 4, which I erased it now, but 4, on page 8, underneath disappointment and the denial of apotheosis, bullet point number 4, this disappointment has led to atheism. Quote in Nietzsche, one has become atheistic, right? This has led to atheism. He says specifically, second paragraph on page 15, note 17, he says, one has unlearned the habit of conceding to this posited ideal, the reality of a person, right? There can't be really, at the apex, right, at the highest posited ideal, an actual person. One has become atheistic. I give up faith, right? I lose my faith, I relinquish my faith. One has become atheistic. And then what he says in note 18 then, we switch one more point, and this is on page 16 of the text. Man then has lost dignity in his own eyes. And I actually want to read a piece of note 18 to make sense of this. Note 18 on page 16, the most universal sign of the modern age, man has lost dignity in his own eyes to an incredible extent. For a long time, the center of the tragic hero of existence in general, right? Man was the center of the tragic hero in general, then at least intent on proving himself closely related to the decisive and essentially valuable side of existence. Like all metaphysicians who wish to cling to the dignity of man with their faith that moral values are cardinal values. Those who have abandoned God, right? After we recognize that this is impossible, right? This collapses, this highest value collapses, is devalued under its own structure. Those who have abandoned God cling that much more firmly to faith in morality. And what we'll see in a little bit, we're not quite there yet, but once this system collapses in on itself, right? And there is no longer this notion of God, right? Because the concept of God collapses in on itself. What we recognize, what we'll recognize, we haven't recognized it yet, is that we replace this notion of God with atheism. Right? And then we'll see how this progresses into pessimism and then nihilism. But we replace this notion with atheism, and what Nietzsche says in the last line of 18, and this is a very, it seems like a rather banal claim, but it's not, right? Those who have abandoned God, who have given up God, who have abandoned God, cling that much more firmly to the faith in morality. So, though there isn't a Christian morality now that Christian morality has been replaced with some new conception of morality. And we'll see exactly what that is as we progress. And we see how, as Nietzsche said in the progression towards what I'm referring to as ultimate nihilism. Remember in the example of ascending the mountain, you get to the very top, you see that all that exists is nihilism, nihilistic world interpretation. It disheartens you, you become discouraged, this is the technical term, you become discouraged, you posit this absolute perfect state of affairs, right? Only to realize that state of affairs can't manifest either, and then you are left with this sort of ultimate concept of nihilism. And this is where we're progressing, right? We have recognized that for those who have abandoned God, so God, the concept of God has now, as the highest value, been devalued, right? They still are clinging to this notion of faith in morality. Okay, So what we recognize now is it's not going to be as easy as one may have thought to completely emancipate ourselves, free ourselves from not only the idea of morality. It's not morality per se, but it is the judgment that is associated with morality. And we'll see how this manifests in a second. All right, next point, failure to renounce the highest value. To renounce, failure to renounce the highest value. First bullet point, despite their disappointments, metaphysicians are still seeking, true reality and the thing in itself. And the quote from Nietzsche is, compared to which everything else is merely apparent, right? So there is a sense in which, despite the fact that we recognize now, according to Nietzsche, that the highest value, God at the apex, is devalued under the weight of the system itself. And to be technical, right, we recognize the inconsistencies, and I talked about this earlier, the inconsistencies in, for example, ascribing to, let's say, the divine command theory, insofar as we believe that an action is right, if and only if God commands the action. If God commands you not to kill, then you not killing is morally right. If God commands you, as in the example of Abraham and Isaac, to kill, then killing is morally acceptable. God then can command an action which is both, God then can command an action which is the same action, God then can command two different actions, right? To kill and not to kill, and both will be morally correct, right? I can say, thou shalt not kill. If you don't kill, that's morally correct. I can tell one individual person to kill. If he does kill, that is morally correct. So both actions are morally correct, despite the fact that both actions are completely antithetical. You can't kill, you can't kill. How in the world are we as human beings, if we're aspiring for the sort of the divine thinking, as Nietzsche says, the divine thinking of God, going to be able to cognitively access that inherent contradiction, right? It's obviously a contradiction. We can't, right? So we don't have access. Insofar as we don't have access, the system collapses. That's the technical meaning of how, that's just one example of the technical meaning of how the system collapses, right? So first bullet point, despite the disappointment, metaphysicians are still seeking true reality and the thing in itself, right? Compared to which everything else is merely apparent, right? There is the belief that I have a perception of this object, right? So I have the idea, if you will, of this object. But my idea of this object is phenomenal. The existence of this object as such is what's known as nominal. Right? This is the thing in itself. And this is like the object as perceived infinitely, right? The infinite perception of the object. Human beings don't have infinite perceptual abilities. We only have, obviously, finite perceptual abilities. Our finite perceptual abilities give us phenomenal perception of objects. What Nietzsche is saying is, with respect to the idea of the highest moral value, despite the fact that we've gotten rid of God, for examples that I've given before, we are still attempting to posit something that functions in exactly the same manner. That is, whatever the new thing is that we fill in at the apex, right? Whatever this thing is that we fill in at the apex, it assumes that there is a thing in itself. There is a real, big R, there is a real reality that transcends human sort of cognitive, perceptual, emotional, emotive, sort of biological, embodied experience, right? There's some non-experiential, non-perceptual reality out there, and that's the reality that we're directed towards, whatever that might be. Absolute truthfulness, God is the divine, some logical, he gives the example of absolute logical coherence and consistency for logicians, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So, despite their disappointments, right, the failure of recognizing that this system is collapsing. The highest values are collapsed.